He married her on a quiet morning wrapped in cold dignity, not because his heart had chosen her, but because duty demanded a decision he believed he would one day regret. As the vows echoed through the stone walls of the cathedral, he stood tall and composed, while she stood beside him with lowered eyes and trembling hands, her voice soft but sincere. Even before the ceremony ended, a bitter truth had already settled in his mind. This marriage was his greatest mistake. She was gentle, reserved, and painfully modest, lacking the sharp brilliance and social sparkle expected of a powerful duke's wife. The whispers began immediately, sliding through the pews and spilling into society halls like poison. Such a title wasted, they said. He could have chosen far better. And instead of silencing them, he allowed their words to take root inside him. From the very first days of marriage, he kept her at a careful distance. At dinners, he spoke to her with polite restraint, never warmth. At balls, he left her alone beneath glittering chandeliers, abandoning her to judgmental stares while he entertained influential allies. She never clung to him, never demanded his attention, never humiliated him with questions or tears. She endured the coldness with quiet dignity, believing perhaps that patience might one day soften him. To him, her silence confirmed his cruel assumption that she was weak, forgettable, and unworthy of notice. He convinced himself that marrying her had dimmed his future, that she was an anchor holding him back. But while he chased admiration outside their home, she quietly rebuilt the world he neglected within it. Alone in the vast estate, she began to notice what he never did, the exhaustion etched into the servants' faces, the resentment brewing among tenants, the silent bleed of mismanaged finances. She listened instead of commanded. She corrected without accusation. She worked quietly, learning the estate's books late into the night, easing burdens where she could, offering kindness where cruelty had ruled for too long. Slowly, almost invisibly, loyalty grew around her. Servants trusted her. Tenants respected her. The estate steadied itself under her gentle but firm guidance. No one praised her. No one noticed her efforts, least of all the man she had married. Then came the storm that stripped him of everything he believed defined him. A scandal erupted suddenly, documents forged, alliances betrayed, accusations whispered in dark corners of Parliament. Men who once praised him turned their backs overnight. Invitations vanished, doors closed, his fortune wavered, his title trembled, and his name, once respected, became a subject of cruel speculation. Pride failed him, authority abandoned him, and for the first time in his life he stood utterly alone. Except for her. While others fled to protect themselves, she remained. When his temper flared and despair hollowed his voice, she did not retreat. She listened. She observed. She acted. Quietly, she stepped into a battle meant to destroy him. She confronted powerful men who dismissed her as insignificant until they realized she understood the truth better than they did. She uncovered lies hidden beneath arrogance and greed. She negotiated where he threatened. She endured insults meant to break her spirit and met them with unwavering resolve. Each step she took placed her reputation, her safety, and her dignity at risk, but she did not hesitate. He watched in stunned silence as the woman he once dismissed stood unshaken before men who terrified him. When the truth finally emerged and the scandal collapsed, it was not his name that commanded respect, it was hers. Society shifted, as it always did, eager to praise what it once ignored. Whispers turned into admiration. The servants looked at her with pride. The tenants spoke her name with gratitude, and standing beside her, he felt something far more painful than humiliation, regret. He remembered every moment he had ignored her, every ballroom where he had left her alone, every cold glance that told her she was invisible. He saw her clearly now, stronger than any ally he had trusted, braver than any man who had stood beside him. And fear crept into his heart, not fear of losing power or title, but fear of losing her. When he finally stood before her, stripped of pride and certainty, his voice faltered. He did not speak as a duke, but as a man broken by his own arrogance. He confessed his regret, his blindness, his shame. He admitted the truth he had denied since the day they wed, that she was never the mistake. He was. She listened quietly, just as she always had. She did not rush to forgive. She had already given too much without being seen. For the first time, the choice belonged to her. In the end, she stayed, not because duty demanded it, but because she chose to. And as he took her hand, this time without distance or pride, he understood the cruel irony of fate. She was never his greatest mistake. She was his only salvation. Years ago, he had destroyed her with a single sentence. It was said casually, almost carelessly, in a crowded ballroom where laughter and music drowned out dignity. When she had dared to hope, dared to believe his kindness meant something more. He dismissed her publicly, his voice sharp with impatience. "Do not misunderstand your place," he had said, his eyes cold, uninterested. "You are insignificant to me." The words cut deeper than any insult shouted in anger. Society heard them. Society remembered, and she stood there, cheeks burning, heart breaking, forced to swallow her humiliation with quiet grace. That night she disappeared from his world, carrying the shame he never bothered to acknowledge. To him, it was nothing more than an inconvenient interaction soon forgotten. To her, it was the moment something inside her hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. Years passed. Fate, however, has a cruel sense of symmetry. When scandal threatened his family name, an old inheritance dispute entangled with dangerous political enemies, he was forced into a union neither of them desired. Circumstance, pressure, and obligation bound them together once more. When she stood before him again, no longer the timid girl he had dismissed, he barely recognized her. She was composed, poised, her gaze steady and unreadable. There was no accusation in her eyes, no plea, only quiet distance. That distance unsettled him far more than anger ever could. Whispers followed them wherever they went. The woman he once humiliated, now his wife. Society watched eagerly, waiting for cracks, for revenge, for drama. But she gave them none. Living under the same roof, he began to see what he had never bothered to notice before. Her intelligence revealed itself not in grand speeches, but in precise decisions. Her strength appeared not in defiance, but in restraint. She handled conflict with calm dignity, earned loyalty without demanding it, and carried herself with a self-respect that made his past cruelty unbearable to remember. Guilt crept into him slowly, insidiously. Each polite conversation reminded him of the girl he had crushed. Each quiet kindness made his shame heavier. He realized, with growing horror, that she had not grown strong despite him, but because she had been forced to survive what he had done to her. Then his world began to unravel. Enemies resurfaced, dragging his past arrogance into the light. Political rivals seized upon old remarks, old dismissals, old grudges. His reputation fractured. Allies distanced themselves. Rumors twisted truth into weapons. The very traits society once admired in him, confidence, authority, pride, were now recast as arrogance and cruelty. He fought back with fury and status, but for the first time it wasn't enough. Doors closed. Support vanished. He was drowning in the consequences of a man he once had been. And still she remained. Not out of obligation, not out of love, but because walking away would have been easier and she had never chosen the easy path. When accusations threatened to destroy him entirely, she stepped forward with terrifying calm. She uncovered inconsistencies no one else bothered to examine. She confronted men twice her influence and spoke without trembling. She corrected lies with facts, dismantled rumors with truth, and endured whispers meant to punish her for standing beside him. Each step she took exposed her once more to the same society that had watched her humiliation years earlier. Yet she did not flinch. She refused to let injustice win, no matter who stood at its center. Watching her defend him shattered something inside him. He remembered her standing alone in that ballroom years ago, cheeks flushed, eyes lowered, dignity barely intact. And now here she was, unmovable, unbreakable, defending the man who had once dismissed her worth. The irony was unbearable. Shame burned deeper than any public disgrace. For the first time, he understood the cost of his words, the weight of his cruelty, the damage done by a moment of careless arrogance. When the truth finally surfaced and the scandal collapsed, his name was cleared, but it was her reputation that rose. Society whispered differently now, not with cruelty but with reluctant respect. And standing beside her, he realized the most painful truth of all. She had become his salvation without ever being his priority. At last he faced her, not as a powerful man accustomed to command, but as someone stripped bare by regret. His voice faltered as he spoke of the past, of his shame, of the woman he had wronged and the man he wished he had been. He did not ask for forgiveness lightly. He did not expect it at all. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable. She had survived his cruelty. She had saved him from ruin, and now the choice rested where it always should have, with her. Her forgiveness when it came was quiet, not absolute, not easy, but real. And in that moment, he finally understood salvation was not found in power or pride, but in humility before the woman he once believed insignificant and who had proven herself greater than them all. On the night they were married, he did not even look back as he left her alone in the grand bedchamber. The candles burned low, the silk sheets remained untouched, and she sat quietly on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. To him, marrying her had already proven to be a mistake, an obligation fulfilled, a burden endured. He told himself she would understand. Women like her always did. She was quiet, compliant, and far too modest to demand what he had never intended to give. While London celebrated his union, he sought distraction elsewhere, convinced that ignoring her was kinder than pretending affection he did not feel. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. At public gatherings, he appeared alone more often than not. When she attended, she stood slightly behind him, unnoticed and unacknowledged. Society noticed, of course. Whispers followed her, the forgotten bride, the wife no one wanted. She heard them all and bore them without protest. She did not weep in public. She did not complain. Instead, she observed. She listened. She learned. Alone within the vast estate, she began to understand the cracks beneath its impressive surface. Unpaid debts masked by grandeur, neglected tenants simmering with resentment, servants fearful of dismissal. Where he ruled with authority from afar, she stepped quietly into the spaces he ignored. Without announcement or recognition, she began to work. She spent long nights reviewing account books she had no obligation to touch, uncovering patterns of waste and deception. She spoke gently to stewards who had grown careless under unchecked power and corrected them with reason rather than threat. She walked the tenant lands herself, listening to grievances no lord had heard in years, restoring fairness with small but meaningful changes. Slowly, the estate stabilized. Loyalty grew not to his name but to hers. Servants trusted her judgment. Tenants respected her fairness. And yet, he remained oblivious, convinced that nothing of value could come from a woman he had dismissed on their wedding night. Then ambition met its reckoning. A rival, patient, cunning, and well aware of his arrogance, set a trap that threatened to destroy him completely. False accusations surfaced, supported by carefully planted evidence. Financial irregularities were exposed without context, twisted to suggest corruption. His political influence weakened as allies distanced themselves, unwilling to risk association. Panic followed swiftly. The authority he had relied upon his entire life failed him when he needed it most. And in the midst of that unraveling, he realized something chilling. He had no one left who truly stood with him. Except her. While he paced and raged, she acted with terrifying calm. She uncovered inconsistencies in the accusations he had overlooked in his fury. She traced forged documents back to their source with quiet determination. She confronted the rival directly, not with anger, but with facts so precise they could not be denied. Each step she took placed her squarely in danger, exposing her to scandal and ridicule, but she did not hesitate. The same woman he had left alone on their wedding night now stood between him and complete ruin. Watching her work shook him to his core. He saw her command rooms he had once dominated, her voice steady, her presence undeniable. He saw men listen to her, not because of his title, but because of her intelligence. The truth emerged piece by piece, and when it finally surfaced in full, it crushed his rival completely. The scandal dissolved not through his strength, but through hers. Society fell silent, and in that silence, realization struck him with brutal clarity. The bride he had ignored had saved everything. Shame followed swiftly. He remembered the untouched bed, the nights he chose distance over decency, the countless moments he had made her feel invisible. He saw now what everyone else had begun to see, a woman of remarkable strength who had never once demanded recognition. Fear crept into him, not of losing power, but of losing her after everything she had endured. When he finally stood before her, stripped of pride and certainty, his voice faltered. He spoke of regret, of blindness, of the night he abandoned her without a second thought. He admitted the truth he had denied for so long, that ignoring her had been the greatest mistake of his life. She listened, composed and calm, no bitterness in her expression. She had survived neglect. She had risen above humiliation, and she had saved him without ever being asked. Her forgiveness, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and earned. As he took her hand, this time with reverence rather than obligation, he understood the final truth with painful clarity. The bride he ignored was never weak. She was never insignificant. She was his greatest mistake only because he failed to see her, and his only salvation because she never stopped being herself. He had walked away from her once without looking back, convinced that choosing ambition over her had been the smartest decision of his life. At the time, it felt simple. She was gentle, loyal, and far too sincere for the ruthless world he intended to conquer. He wanted influence, wealth, and a name that commanded fear and admiration. She wanted honesty, stability, and a partnership built on trust. When he told her it was over, he spoke with polished calm, as though dismissing something inconsequential. "This cannot continue," he had said, already thinking of his future. She had stood there silently, eyes glistening but proud, refusing to beg. That was what made it easy for him to forget her, or so he believed. Years later, fate forced her back into his life in the cruelest way imaginable. A political disaster threatened to destroy his family's legacy, and the only way to prevent complete ruin was a marriage alliance arranged by powerful relatives. When she stepped into the drawing room as his intended bride, time seemed to stop. She was no longer the hopeful woman he had abandoned. She carried herself with composed dignity, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. There was no accusation in her eyes, no longing, no resentment, only distance. That distance unsettled him more than anger ever could. Society whispered relentlessly, savoring the irony. The woman he discarded, now his wife. They watched closely, expecting bitterness, revenge, or spectacle. She gave them none. Living under the same roof again reopened wounds he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. He noticed how she managed the household effortlessly, how servants responded to her with respect rather than fear. He saw her treat everyone with fairness, listening before speaking, commanding loyalty without demanding it. Slowly, painfully, he realized what he had thrown away years ago, not weakness, but strength he had been too arrogant to recognize. The past lingered between them like an unhealed scar, and guilt followed him relentlessly. Every polite exchange reminded him of the woman he had hurt and the life he had abandoned for ambition. Then the reckoning arrived. Scandal erupted, fueled by enemies eager to destroy him. Old decisions resurfaced, twisted into weapons. Accusations spread rapidly, and society, ever eager for downfall, turned its back on him. Allies vanished. Invitations ceased. His name, once spoken with respect, became synonymous with disgrace. Panic consumed him as his carefully built reputation crumbled. For the second time in his life, he faced the consequences of his choices, and once again he found himself standing alone. Except she did not leave. When others distanced themselves, she remained firmly at his side, fully aware of the cost. She confronted those who sought to ruin him, exposing inconsistencies with calm precision. She navigated society's treacherous circles with intelligence and restraint, countering lies with truth. Each step she took placed her own reputation at risk, reopening wounds from the past. Still, she stood unwavering. Watching her defend him, after everything he had done, shattered him completely. He remembered the day he abandoned her, the certainty with which he had chosen ambition over love. Now, witnessing her courage, he understood the depth of his mistake. She had grown stronger not because of his absence, but in spite of it. And now, when his world collapsed, she was the only one person willing to stand beside him. When the truth finally emerged and the scandal collapsed, it was her composure and intelligence that restored his standing. Society shifted once again, reluctantly admiring the woman they had underestimated. And as he watched her accept their praise with quiet grace, shame overwhelmed him. The woman he had tried to forget had become the reason he still stood at all. At last, he faced her, not as a powerful man used to command, but as someone broken by regret. His voice faltered as he spoke of the past, of his selfish ambition, of the day he chose wrongly. He admitted the truth he had denied for years, that abandoning her had been the greatest mistake of his life. He did not ask for forgiveness lightly, nor did he expect it. She listened in silence, her expression calm, her posture unyielding. She had survived his absence. She had endured humiliation and heartbreak, and she had returned stronger than ever. Forgiveness, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet, earned, and conditional, born not of obligation, but of choice. As he took her hand, this time with humility rather than certainty, he understood the cruel irony fate had carved into his life. The woman he tried to forget was never a weakness. She was never expendable. She was his greatest mistake, only because he failed to value her. And his only salvation, because she chose to stand beside him when no one else would. From the moment he married her, he believed he had made a grave error. She was too quiet, too restrained, too easily overlooked for a man of his stature. Society expected a duchess who dazzled, sharp wit, striking beauty, effortless charm. Instead, he had chosen a woman who spoke softly, moved carefully, and never demanded attention. At dinners, she listened more than she spoke. At gatherings, she remained at his side without clinging. To him, her silence felt like emptiness. He mistook her calm for weakness and convinced himself that marrying her had been the greatest miscalculation of his life. When others hinted at his poor choice, he did not disagree. He simply looked away, allowing her to stand unnoticed in the shadow of his name. What he failed to see was the quiet power she carried. Within the household, she observed everything. She noticed which servants were loyal and which were corrupt. She understood alliances long before they became visible. While he ruled loudly, she influenced silently. Servants came to her with truths they would never speak aloud to him. Neighbors trusted her judgment. Even politicians who dismissed her as inconsequential often left conversations realizing they had revealed far more than intended. She never sought credit. She never corrected his assumptions. She worked in silence, strengthening the foundations of a life he barely bothered to inspect. Then came the accusation. It struck swiftly and without mercy, a charge of betrayal severe enough to threaten his title, his fortune, and his very freedom. Documents surfaced. Witnesses appeared. Powerful enemies moved in unison, eager to destroy him. The man who had always commanded respect found himself isolated overnight. Allies distanced themselves. Friends turned cautious. The court watched with cold interest as his downfall seemed inevitable. Panic set in. Anger followed. He lashed out, demanding loyalty from those already gone. And in that moment of complete unraveling, he realized how utterly alone he was. Except she did not leave. While others fled, she stepped forward, calm, focused, unafraid. She began piecing together details he had overlooked in his fury, patterns in testimony, inconsistencies in documents, motives hidden beneath false righteousness. She spoke to servants who trusted her implicitly and learned truths buried beneath fear. She navigated social circles with careful precision, listening more than she spoke, allowing arrogance to expose itself. Each step she took placed her directly in danger, but she did not hesitate. She understood what was at stake, not just his life, but the truth. When the moment came, she stood before men who believed her powerless, and with quiet authority she dismantled the lies one by one. Facts replaced accusations. Truth exposed ambition masquerading as justice. The room shifted as realization dawned. The charges collapsed. The conspirators were unmasked. And the man who had once underestimated his wife watched in stunned silence as the woman he believed insignificant saved him from complete ruin. Society turned quickly, as it always did. Where they once whispered with satisfaction, they now murmured with reluctant admiration. They spoke her name softly, with curiosity and respect. The quiet wife had become a force no one could ignore. Shame consumed him. He remembered every time he dismissed her presence, every occasion he chose indifference over kindness, every moment he allowed society to belittle her without defense. He saw now what he had been blind to all along. Strength does not always announce itself. Power does not always demand attention. And loyalty, when given freely, is the rarest gift of all. When he finally faced her, there was no authority left in his voice, only regret. He spoke of his arrogance, of the assumptions he had made, of the blindness that nearly destroyed him. He confessed the truth without excuse, that believing her weak had been the greatest mistake of his life. He did not ask for forgiveness as a right. He asked as a man who understood he might not deserve it. She listened quietly, as she always had. She had endured neglect. She had endured silence. She had endured being unseen. And yet she had chosen to act not for recognition, not for gratitude, but because abandoning justice would have betrayed herself. When she spoke at last, her words were simple and steady. Forgiveness, she said, was not something owed. It was something earned. And he understood then that salvation was not the absence of punishment, but the chance to change. As he took her hand, this time with humility rather than assumption, he understood the final truth with painful clarity. The quiet wife he once dismissed was never his weakness. She was never his burden. She was his greatest mistake, only because he failed to see her worth. And his only salvation, because she chose to stand when everyone else turned away.